Before we dive into today's story, a quick friendly reminder. If you enjoy tales of shocking suburban drama, wild HOA corruption, and unforgettable justice, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Now, let's begin. It all started in a quiet cul-de-sac where freshly cut grass and painted shutters created the illusion of peace. The kind of neighborhood that looks perfect on a postcard. Neighbors waved politely, dogs barked from behind fences, and flower beds framed every walkway with symmetrical beauty. But beneath the surface of that neat perfection, something rotten was festering. The community was governed by an HOA, an organization that presented itself as the guardian of harmony and standards. It claimed to keep property values high, to preserve beauty, and to maintain safety. But like so many things that shine on the surface, what was beneath the polish told a much darker story. At the center of it all was an HOA president named Margaret Whitfield. On the outside, Margaret was the picture of suburban leadership. She was in her late 50s, always perfectly dressed, always armed with a warm smile that never quite reached her eyes. To new residents, she seemed like the kind of woman who held the neighborhood together. But to those who had lived there long enough, she was a figure of control, wielding her authority like a weapon. Rules bent for her friends. Fines crushed those who dared to cross her. When the monthly dues suddenly spiked by 300%, most people grumbled quietly and paid. But one resident didn't. Evelyn Carter had moved into the neighborhood with her husband and teenage son only 3 years earlier. She was not one to be intimidated, not by Margaret and not by anyone. Evelyn had a background in accounting, and when she looked at the paperwork the HOA sent out, something didn't add up. The line items listed extravagant charges for landscaping, community development, and something called the Garden Walls Project. According to the budget, over $2 million had been poured into reinforcing the brick walls surrounding the community. Yet Evelyn had seen those walls herself. They were aging but solid, requiring maybe a coat of paint, not millions of dollars in structural work. She started asking questions. At first, the questions were casual, simple emails to the HOA board requesting clarity on the numbers. But her inquiries were met with silence. Then came vague responses, dismissive remarks, and finally, sharp warnings that she should stop digging where she didn't belong. Evelyn didn't stop. Instead, she began collecting copies of all the HOA records she could get her hands on. She examined every invoice, every receipt, every signed document she could track down. The more she looked, the stranger it became. The companies listed as contractors barely existed. Some were registered under fake names. Others were tied to shell corporations with addresses that traced back to empty lots or UPS mailboxes. Her discovery wasn't just about financial mismanagement. It was fraud. Large-scale fraud that drained money from every family in the community. But exposing it wouldn't be easy. Margaret wasn't just a neighborhood busybody with too much power. She was someone with connections. She surrounded herself with people who owed her favors, people who feared her, and people who would gladly look the other way if it meant keeping their own lives comfortable. Still, Evelyn pushed forward. She started a private blog, documenting her findings step by step. At first, it was only a few neighbors who read her post. But soon, word spread. Stories of inflated charges and mysterious expenses resonated with residents who had long felt uneasy but never had the proof to speak up. The blog gained traction. Views multiplied. Emails started pouring in from people in other neighborhoods with similar stories of crooked HOAs and corrupt presidents. Margaret noticed. And when Margaret noticed, she acted. The first response was subtle. Anonymous letters slipped into Evelyn's mailbox, warning her to stop her little hobby. Then came threats disguised as official notices, claims that her house was in violation of obscure HOA codes, fines stacking up for supposed infractions like improper grass height and unapproved mailbox design. The campaign was meant to break her spirit, to remind her that in this neighborhood, Margaret's word was law. But Margaret underestimated Evelyn. Instead of folding under the pressure, Evelyn grew bolder. She knew that with every threat, she was getting closer to the truth. And deep down, she could sense that Margaret was afraid. What Evelyn didn't yet realize was just how far Margaret was willing to go to protect her empire of lies. The turning point came one gray morning when Evelyn returned home from the grocery store. She noticed something strange. Her back gate was unlatched. At first, she thought her son had left it open. But when she stepped inside, she froze. Her garden beds had been destroyed, plants uprooted, soil tossed aside, and the fence vandalized with spray paint. In crude, shaky letters, a message stretched across the boards. "Stop digging, or else." Evelyn stood in her yard, the bags of groceries slipping from her arms, and realized that this was no longer just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This was personal. The mask of suburban civility had fallen, and the true face of the neighborhood war was beginning to show. And that was only the beginning of a storm that would consume everyone behind the garden walls. The garden vandalism was no random act. Evelyn knew it the moment she saw the spray paint dripping down her fence. This wasn't a petty teenager playing a prank. It was a message, deliberate and personal, delivered to keep her silent. But the act had the opposite effect. Instead of silencing her, it fueled her determination. Evelyn took photographs of the damage, catalogued every detail, and added it to her growing archive of evidence. Her blog post that evening was her most explosive yet. She published not only the images of her destroyed garden, but also a detailed breakdown of the fraudulent invoices she had uncovered. She laid it all out clearly. The fake companies, the non-existent projects, the impossible price tags. By the time she pressed publish, she knew the story was no longer confined to her street or her neighborhood. It was spreading like wildfire. The post went viral within 48 hours. Comments flooded in from across the country. People shared their own horror stories of HOA corruption, fraudulent fees, intimidation tactics, even suspicious disappearances of whistleblowers. The suburban nightmare Evelyn thought she was fighting alone suddenly felt like part of something much bigger, a national epidemic of greed hiding behind manicured lawns. The sudden attention placed Evelyn in the spotlight, and with that spotlight came consequences. Margaret could no longer dismiss her as a harmless busybody. Evelyn had exposed something dangerous, and Margaret's power was slipping through her fingers. That's when Margaret escalated. Anonymous vehicles began parking near Evelyn's house at night. Their engines idled in silence, headlights off, shadows shifting just beyond the edges of the street lamp. On more than one occasion, Evelyn woke to find her trash cans overturned or her mailbox ripped from its post. It was harassment designed to wear her down, to remind her she was being watched. But Evelyn's spirit held. Her son, however, was shaken. He refused to walk home alone from school. He whispered to his mother about strange men near the playground, about overhearing neighbors gossip that his family was bringing shame on the community. The intimidation was no longer confined to Evelyn, it was seeping into her family's life. Margaret knew exactly what she was doing. By turning the community against Evelyn, she hoped to isolate her, to make the price of resistance unbearable. At the next HOA meeting, Margaret put on her sweetest mask. Standing in front of rows of uneasy neighbors, she delivered a carefully rehearsed speech. She framed Evelyn not as a brave whistleblower but as a troublemaker, someone spreading lies and conspiracy theories, someone destroying the unity and reputation of their beloved neighborhood. She smiled as she spoke, but her words were poison. Fears spread like infection. Some neighbors turned cold, refusing to meet Evelyn's eyes when she passed. Others whispered behind closed doors. A few even repeated Margaret's words back to her, accusing her of tearing the community apart for her own selfish reasons. Still, there were those who believed Evelyn. Quietly, they slipped her copies of their own letters from the HOA, notices of bizarre fines and inexplicable charges. They shared rumors of secret meetings Margaret had held, of favors exchanged, of residents who moved away suddenly after challenging her authority. Evelyn realized she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone too afraid to speak out. But Margaret's empire was vast, and her reach extended further than Evelyn ever imagined. Soon Evelyn discovered that her employer had received anonymous complaints about her conduct. Her husband's car was mysteriously towed and saddled with fees that made no sense. Even the family's insurance company received a tip that triggered a surprise audit. The attacks were relentless, designed to choke the Carter family from every direction. The neighborhood itself seemed to conspire against them. Evelyn would return home to find for sale flyers shoved through her door with mocking notes scrawled in the margins. Better leave before it's too late. But Evelyn didn't bend. Instead, she doubled down. With every attack, she documented meticulously. She published everything on her blog, every fine, every letter, every petty act of vandalism. Her transparency made it impossible for Margaret to control the narrative. And the more Evelyn revealed, the more cracks began to show in Margaret's carefully maintained facade. Behind closed doors, Margaret was unraveling. Her once flawless image was tarnished. Neighbors who had once adored her were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Even members of her own HOA board were starting to wonder how much of the budgetary chaos was real and how much was orchestrated. But Margaret was not the type to admit defeat. If intimidation and reputation warfare weren't enough, then she would take even darker steps. Late one night, Evelyn heard the sound of glass shattering. She rushed to the kitchen to find her back window broken, shards glittering on the floor. On the counter lay a brick wrapped in paper. Scrawled across the page were 3 words. Final warning, stop. The sound of sirens filled the air as Evelyn called the police, but the responding officers seemed weary, almost disinterested. They wrote their report, promised to investigate, and left. Deep down, Evelyn knew they wouldn't do much. Margaret's connections ran deep, and those connections made her nearly untouchable. As Evelyn swept the glass from her floor that night, she realized she was standing at a crossroad. She could stop now and salvage some semblance of peace, or she could keep going, risking everything to expose the truth. And for Evelyn, the decision was already made. This was no longer just about money. It was about justice, about protecting her family, about ensuring that Margaret Whitfield, the queen of the HOA, would finally answer for her crimes. But Evelyn had underestimated how dangerous her enemy truly was, because Margaret was already planning her next move, one that would shake the entire community to its core. The breaking window had been more than a scare tactic, it was a declaration. Margaret had stopped hiding behind fines, rules, and whispers. Now she was sending a clear message that Evelyn's persistence would be punished with force. In the days that followed, the neighborhood seemed to shift. Evelyn noticed unfamiliar faces loitering near the playground, cars idling at corners with tinted windows, and shadows lingering on sidewalks after dark. The sense of safety she once felt in her own home was gone. Every sound made her tense, every knock on the door made her wonder who might be on the other side. But if Margaret thought fear would silence Evelyn, she had miscalculated. Evelyn's blog posts grew more relentless. She published entire spreadsheets of HOA expenses, showing line after line of payments to companies that didn't exist. She exposed connections between Margaret's family members and those shell companies, highlighting the flow of money that disappeared into the ether. The posts gained national traction. Local reporters began calling, asking for interviews. Evelyn's story was spreading far beyond the cul-de-sac. Margaret's polished image of a community leader was crumbling in real time, replaced by the picture of a corrupt tyrant. And that was when Margaret decided she needed help. Late one evening, while most of the neighborhood slept, Margaret hosted a private gathering at her home. Not of neighbors, not of friends, but of men who didn't belong in any suburban setting. Broad-shouldered, hard-faced men who moved with the quiet confidence of people who knew how to intimidate. Margaret wasn't just leaning on her influence anymore. She was bringing in outsiders to do the kind of work polite suburban hands wouldn't touch. Evelyn sensed the change almost immediately. The harassment sharpened. Strange packages arrived on her porch, one containing a dead rat, another filled with shredded pieces of her own blog post. Her car tires were slashed twice in the same week, and one night, when her husband returned late from work, he found their front door slightly ajar. Inside, nothing was stolen, but the message was clear. Someone had been there. Someone could come and go as they pleased. Fear crept into every corner of the Carter household. Her son began sleeping with his light on, whispering that he heard footsteps outside his window. Evelyn tried to reassure him, but in her heart, she was battling her own fear. Despite the dread, she continued her work. Each threat became another entry in her record, another piece of evidence she uploaded to her growing archive. What Margaret didn't realize was that Evelyn was no longer fighting alone. Strangers, readers of her blog, were beginning to send her tips, background information, even professional insight into the shell companies. She had accountants, lawyers, and investigators rooting through the digital trail Margaret thought she had buried. But Margaret wasn't blind to the growing support Evelyn was receiving, and that made her even more desperate. The breaking point came one stormy night. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder shook the walls. Evelyn was working late at her desk when the power suddenly cut out. The house plunged into darkness. She reached for her phone, but before she could find the flashlight, she heard it, movement downstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the living room floor. Her heart pounded as she crept to the top of the stairs. Through the sliver of light from her phone, she saw the outline of a man, tall and broad, standing near the window. He wasn't looking for valuables. He wasn't searching through drawers. He was waiting. By the time Evelyn whispered for her husband, the man had slipped out the back door, vanishing into the storm. They called the police, but just like before, the response was cold efficiency and little action. No forced entry, no stolen property, no crime to pursue. Just another unfortunate incident in a neighborhood that was supposed to be safe. For Evelyn, the message was undeniable. Margaret had escalated from harassment to invasion. She wasn't just trying to scare Evelyn anymore. She was testing boundaries, showing how easily those walls of security could crumble. The next morning, Evelyn posted again. She wrote not about the break-in, but about the resolve it had sparked. Her words carried weight, power born of defiance. She knew people were watching, not just neighbors but strangers across the country who saw in her struggle a reflection of their own. Margaret read those words too, and for the first time, she felt cornered. Evelyn wasn't breaking. The threats weren't working. The fines weren't working. Even fear wasn't working. If she didn't act soon, her carefully built empire of fraud and control would collapse. And so, Margaret made a choice that would mark the point of no return. She would remove Evelyn completely. What had begun as a petty neighborhood power struggle was about to transform into a battle of survival. The perfect suburban facade was cracking wide open, and beneath it lay something far darker than anyone had ever imagined. Because the next step in Margaret's plan wasn't intimidation. It was elimination. Margaret had built her empire on fear and silence. For years, neighbors accepted her word without question, believing the glossy image of order she projected. But Evelyn had shattered that illusion. Each blog post, each revelation, tore down the wall of respectability Margaret had hidden behind. And the cracks were spreading fast. The first signs of fracture appeared at the next HOA meeting. The gatherings, once orderly affairs where Margaret presided with polite authority, had become tense battlegrounds. Neighbors who had once praised her leadership now demanded explanations. Where had the money gone? Why were the invoices so vague? Why did so many contractors share addresses with P.O. boxes miles away from the community? Margaret responded with the same tactics she had always used: charm, dismissal, veiled threats. But the murmurs in the crowd were louder this time. The questions kept coming. The aura of control she had wielded for years was slipping away, and she could feel it. Behind closed doors, Margaret grew paranoid. She no longer trusted her board members, fearing they might turn on her to save themselves. She began holding secret meetings in her home, guarded not by polite neighbors but by the same men who had stalked Evelyn's house. These men weren't interested in community rules or landscaping fees. They were interested in power, money, and control. Margaret had stepped far beyond the boundaries of suburban leadership. She had entered the world of enforcers. Meanwhile, Evelyn's blog had exploded into something much larger than a neighborhood project. National news outlets picked up her story, framing it as a symbol of everyday corruption hiding in plain sight. Viewership skyrocketed. What began as a fight to expose inflated invoices had become a narrative of survival, a suburban David versus Goliath tale that captured the attention of thousands. The attention was a double-edged sword. While Evelyn's supporters grew, so did the danger. Margaret's desperation hardened into something ruthless. She could feel the walls closing in, and she knew her only chance was to silence Evelyn permanently. The plan took shape in whispers. Late-night phone calls, cash payments slipped into envelopes, and quiet promises made to dangerous people. Margaret wasn't just planning to intimidate Evelyn anymore, she was orchestrating her removal, a disappearance that could be written off as an accident, another statistic in a world too busy to care about one suburban family. The first step came quietly. Evelyn's car was tampered with. She noticed it one morning as she drove her son to school. The brakes felt unsteady, the steering loose. At the mechanic's shop, the truth came out. Someone had deliberately cut the brake lines. Evelyn's blood ran cold. This wasn't a prank or harassment, or even a threat. This was an attempt on her life. Still, she refused to stop. If anything, she doubled her efforts, publishing the story in detail for the world to see. She described the sabotage, the fear, and the undeniable pattern of escalation. Her readers responded with outrage. Offers of legal help poured in. Former HOA members from other communities shared their own stories of threats and intimidation. Evelyn's narrative was becoming a movement, a rallying cry for transparency and justice. Margaret, however, was unraveling. Her once flawless image cracked further with each passing day. Neighbors whispered about the cars parked outside her home at all hours, about the strange men who now seemed to shadow her every move. Parents no longer let their children play near her yard. Invitations to charity events dried up. Even her closest allies began to distance themselves, sensing the inevitable collapse. But Margaret clung to her power with the desperation of someone who had too much to lose. She had siphoned millions through her schemes, funneled into shell companies and hidden accounts. If Evelyn's investigation succeeded, it wouldn't just cost Margaret her position, it would cost her freedom. That knowledge pushed her to a breaking point. The night of the storm had been only a rehearsal. Now she began planning something final, something irreversible. She reached out to her enforcers, instructing them to make the problem disappear. Evelyn Carter needed to be silenced forever. Yet Margaret had underestimated one crucial factor: the community itself. The same neighbors she had ruled with fear were beginning to see her clearly. They were no longer afraid to speak in hushed tones, no longer willing to look away. Evelyn's courage had inspired them. And when a community loses its fear, the tyrant's days are numbered. The fractures widened further when a leak appeared, not from Evelyn, but from within Margaret's own circle. Someone on the HOA board, disgusted by what they had seen, slipped documents to a local reporter. The files confirmed everything Evelyn had said and more: fraudulent contracts, hidden accounts, and evidence of intimidation tactics designed to crush dissent. The story broke wide open. Television crews descended on the neighborhood. Reporters prowled the sidewalks, asking questions, knocking on doors. Margaret's name, once spoken with deference, was now plastered across headlines as a symbol of corruption. Cornered and desperate, Margaret's plan accelerated. The men she had hired were already watching Evelyn's house, waiting for the signal. The window for silence was closing, and Margaret was determined to act before the world learned the full extent of her crimes. Evelyn, though shaken, felt something shift as well. The fear that had haunted her steps was giving way to resolve. She could feel the momentum turning. For the first time, Margaret wasn't the one in control. But that shift was precisely what made the days ahead the most dangerous of all. Because Margaret Whitfield wasn't about to go quietly. And when power begins to slip through desperate hands, violence often follows. By the time the first television trucks rolled into the neighborhood, Margaret Whitfield's empire was already trembling. The woman who once walked the streets with perfect posture and a fixed smile now moved like a shadow of herself, darting from door to door, whispering to allies who were slipping away. She tried to hold onto the illusion of control, but it was gone. Her kingdom of manicured lawns and painted fences had turned against her. Evelyn Carter had become the symbol of that revolt. Reporters called her the whistleblower, the neighborhood's truth-teller, and even the suburban warrior. She hated the attention, but she knew it was necessary. Her blog had transformed into a national voice, and each post drew thousands more to her cause. The story wasn't just about one HOA anymore, it was about corruption hiding in plain sight across the country. But Margaret wasn't finished. The tighter the walls closed in, the more ruthless she became. Her meetings with her hired enforcers grew urgent. The instructions were blunt. Evelyn had to be silenced. Permanently. The men began circling more openly. One was spotted leaning against a car near the school. Another loitered outside Evelyn's workplace. Neighbors noticed and whispered, but fear still held many of them back from speaking too loudly. Evelyn felt the weight of every shadow, the press of every unmarked vehicle parked too long at the corner. She was careful with her routines, careful with her movements, but she knew it was only a matter of time before the intimidation gave way to something worse. The attempt came on a Friday evening. Evelyn was driving home from a late interview when headlights appeared in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought nothing of it, but as she turned onto quieter streets, the lights stayed close. Too close. When she accelerated, so did they. When she slowed, they matched her pace. The car trailed her through the winding roads until she reached a stretch of highway where there were no cameras, no houses, just dark asphalt and empty field. That's when the vehicle lunged forward. The engine roared, and the car swerved aggressively, slamming against the side of her vehicle. Evelyn fought for control, gripping the wheel with white knuckles as sparks flew where metal scraped metal. She veered hard, managing to stay on the road, but the message was unmistakable. This wasn't random road rage. This was a warning, or worse, an attempt to end her story right there. She made it home shaken but alive. And once again, she turned her fear into fuel. The very next morning, her blog exploded with a new post. The photographs of her dented car, the detailed account of the pursuit, and her declaration that she would not be silenced. Readers rallied around her, and support surged. What Margaret intended as intimidation became further evidence of her guilt. But Margaret was unraveling quickly. The news outlets now reported on her with open suspicion. Old allies abandoned her. Even her inner circle began to crumble. It was during this time that Evelyn's investigation uncovered the final piece of the puzzle. Records linking Margaret directly to offshore accounts where millions of dollars in HOA funds had been funneled. The documents left no doubt. It was the evidence that could end Margaret's reign forever. And Margaret knew it. Her paranoia reached its peak. She barked orders at the men she hired, urging them to act swiftly before Evelyn's evidence reached the authorities. Her house, once a symbol of suburban perfection, now looked like a bunker, with unfamiliar faces guarding the front steps and curtains drawn tightly shut. Neighbors crossed the street rather than walk past. The night before Evelyn was set to release her final report, Margaret made her most dangerous move yet. Under cover of darkness, her men prepared to strike. The plan was simple. Evelyn would be taken from her home. No witnesses, no survival, no more blog posts. It was a plan born of desperation, the kind of reckless act that happens when someone realizes their power is slipping away forever. But Margaret had overlooked one thing: the community itself. Whispers had spread. Neighbors who once turned a blind eye now watched closely. Cameras captured unfamiliar vehicles prowling the street. And Evelyn's supporters, both near and far, had grown too numerous to be silenced. Among them were people who knew how to fight back. Former law enforcement officers, journalists with deep sources, even legal advocates who had seen this kind of corruption before. Evelyn wasn't standing alone anymore. The night Margaret sent her men toward Evelyn's home, they weren't the only ones in the shadows. Neighbors with phones stood watch. Journalists waited nearby, tipped off by Evelyn herself. Even unmarked police vehicles lingered discreetly, responding to growing evidence Evelyn had shared with them. As the enforcers approached, the trap began to close, not around Evelyn but around Margaret. Her breaking point had arrived. And with it, the perfect suburban facade she had built for decades was about to collapse completely. What Margaret didn't yet realize was that her empire wasn't going to end quietly in whispered accusations or blog posts. It was going to unravel in front of everyone, with the entire community as witnesses. The night began with silence. Evelyn sat at her desk, the glow of her computer lighting her determined face. The report was finished. Hundreds of pages of invoices, shell companies, fraudulent accounts, and offshore transfers. Everything was there, neatly documented, ready to be released to the public by morning. But Evelyn knew she wouldn't sleep. Not tonight. Outside, the streets were unusually quiet. The storm clouds that had threatened all day had finally broken, releasing a steady drizzle that darkened the pavement. To the casual eye, it was just another quiet suburban night. But beneath the surface, something was stirring. Margaret's men moved through the shadows, circling the Carter home with calculated precision. They carried themselves with the confidence of people who had done this before, faces hidden under hats, footsteps muffled on wet grass. The plan was simple: remove Evelyn, destroy the evidence, and restore Margaret's control. But Margaret's empire had already rotted from within. What she didn't know was that Evelyn had prepared for this moment. Weeks of threats and harassment had taught her that intimidation would not stop. She had shared her files with allies, reporters, even investigators who now sat quietly in unmarked vehicles nearby. Her home, once isolated, was now watched by more eyes than Margaret could have imagined. The first mistake came quickly. One of the men cut the power to the Carter house, plunging it into darkness. Within seconds, Evelyn's backup generator kicked in, flooding the home with light again. Cameras hidden around the property captured every movement. The men froze, realizing too late that their presence had been exposed. From across the street, neighbors stirred. Some filmed from windows, others whispered into phones. A few, braver than the rest, stepped onto porches to watch. The community Margaret had ruled with fear was no longer silent. And then came the sound of engines. Not the quiet hum of suburban cars but the unmistakable roar of vehicles pulling in fast. Police cruisers, news vans, and unmarked sedans filled the cul-de-sac. Flashing lights painted the night in red and blue. The men scattered, but there was nowhere to run. Officers swarmed, pinning them to the ground, pulling weapons from their hands and shouting commands. The cameras captured everything: the failed attempt, the arrests, the proof that Margaret's intimidation had crossed into open criminality. Inside her home, Evelyn stood at the window, heart pounding as she watched the empire of fear collapse outside her door. Margaret, however, wasn't finished. She emerged from her house minutes later, drawn by the chaos. Her once flawless hair was disheveled, her clothes wrinkled, her face pale under the flashing lights. She shouted at the officers, demanded they release her men, claimed it was all a misunderstanding. But no one was listening anymore. Reporters swarmed her with cameras, neighbors shouted accusations, and officers closed in with warrants in hand. The documents Evelyn had uncovered had already been passed to federal investigators. The evidence was overwhelming, embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and now attempted violence. Margaret's voice cracked as she tried to hold onto the last shreds of her authority. But there was no authority left. She wasn't the queen of the neighborhood anymore. She was just another criminal dragged into the light. The final image of Margaret Whitfield was not of power or control, but of a woman in handcuffs, her manicured hands bound behind her back as she was led into a waiting car. Neighbors who once feared her stood together, watching as the illusion finally shattered. Some cheered. Others wept. Most simply stared, struggling to believe that the woman who had ruled their lives for years was gone. For Evelyn, the moment was bittersweet. She hadn't wanted fame or recognition, only the truth. But as she sat in her living room with her family, the lights of police cars fading in the distance, she realized her fight had never been just for herself. It had been for every neighbor too afraid to speak, for every family drained by corruption, for every voice silenced by intimidation. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. The HOA dissolved, replaced by a residents' association where decisions were made in the open and finances were transparent. The fear that once lingered in every interaction lifted, replaced by something that had been missing for years: trust. Evelyn's blog became a national platform for reform. Her story inspired others across the country to look more closely at their own communities, to question authority, to demand accountability. What began as one woman asking about inflated invoices had become a movement exposing corruption hiding behind white picket fences everywhere. As for Margaret, she faced a trial that captured national attention. The woman who once posed as the embodiment of suburban perfection was sentenced to decades in prison, her carefully crafted image forever destroyed. And Evelyn? She returned to her garden, the same place where the first threat had been scrawled across her fence. She rebuilt the flower beds, replanted the soil, and watched new life take root where destruction had once reigned. For her, it was more than gardening. It was a reminder that even in the darkest battles, growth was possible. The community had found its voice. The truth had surfaced. And Margaret's reign of fear had ended where it belonged, behind bars. Evelyn Carter never wanted to be a hero, but in the end, her courage had turned her into one.